the second of 3 evening talks given by Linda Martín Alcoff on race, culture, history in the context of this year's Adorno lectures. To start with, I should present myself, introduce myself. I forgot that yesterday. My apologies for that. After the talk given by Linda, someone came up to me and asked, told me, oh, the talk was great, but who the hell are you? I'm Stefan Lessening, director of the Institut for Sozialforschung. To start with, I will shortly summarize what happened so far, was bisher geschah, for those who haven't been able to be present yesterday, mainly for Rainer Voss. But also as a reminder of what happened yesterday for those who have been here. So, yesterday, Linda Martín Alcoff sketched the project of a critical philosophy of race that moves beyond social constructivism, and instead makes a case for races and racial identities as historical formations. Racial identities thus are best understood as formed through historical events, and the historical, I think that has changed for the worse. Racial identities thus are best understood as formed through historical events, and the historical formation of race is a dynamic and ongoing process. What Linda Alcoff puts forward is a realist view on race and racial identities, in which the nature of the real is meant to be perpetually unstable and changeable. Racial identities are conceptualized as forms of life that have been forged by historical processes involving most centrally colonialism, but also by the agency and force of resistance devised by the colonized. Historical events have brought into existence racialized identity formations in terms of ways of being and habits of action, explaining why racial identities cannot be easily unmade, as social constructivists might think, through shifts in institutional policy or by altering the acceptable norms of speech. Races and racial identities, and Linda Alcoff showed this in her talk with regards to the historical genealogy of whiteness, are not simply the product of policy, but of practices, actions, relationships, and experiences that have shaped subjectivity, perception, and judgment across generations. Whiteness, we will hear more about that tomorrow in the third talk. Whiteness is a dynamic historical formation that emerged to define unruliness as a characteristic only of the non-white other. And whiteness will be changed. This was the argument with which Linda closed her first talk. Whiteness will be changed only by the future historical experiences of white people. Linda, we are eager to hear the second talk.
Thank you. It's nice when somebody else summarizes your work, because it's so hard to do, you know. So the sound is working in the, okay, that's my technical expert over there. In the back, the sound is working. Okay. So tonight we're going to focus, I really want to spend some time focused on this topic of cultural racism. I want to explore what the concept of cultural racism adds to the current discussions about racism. I'm going to argue that it adds quite a lot and maybe also does some subtracting. The focus on cultural racism, I'm going to argue, will help us more thoroughly move away from the individualist frame in which racism is understood as an individual attitude, a disposition, or a problem of bias that can be addressed at the individual level, for example, through diversity training. The idea that racism is a form of bias also lends itself to an ahistorical analysis that sees racism as a disposition that is just part of human nature. Racism, it is sometimes said, simply emerges from our need to categorize and differentiate and from our natural fear of difference. The other aspect of individualist approaches is that they sometimes define racism as the inability to see some persons as individuals. Or in other words, that the target of racism is an individual who is mistakenly seen not as an individual, but as the representative of a group. And so they're reduced to their group status. So in this way of thinking, racism is a problem because it denies some individuals their individuality. And there's certainly some validity to this approach, the idea of preemptively judging individuals' likely skills and attributes on the basis of their membership in the group eclipses their individual distinctiveness. But note that it does not necessarily challenge the overall assessment of their group. The individual could be seen as an exception. Biological racism is often seen as operating in this way, as an illegitimate deterministic claim about individuals. Yet, as Fanon argued, when biological racism began to lose its widespread credibility after World War II, he says, the object or the target of racism became no longer the individual man, but a certain form of existing. As Ramon Grossvogel notes, and here's a long quote from Grossvogel, he says, after the Second World War, there was an important shift in the global colonial racial formation. The Nazi occupations delegitimized biological racist discourses in many continental Western European countries. The decline of biological racist discourses did not imply the end of racism in the core of the capitalist world economy. After the defeat of the Nazi occupations in Western Europe in the 1960s, civil rights struggles in Great Britain and in the United States, global racial discourses shifted from biological racism to cultural racism, unquote. So in this shift, the target was no longer the individual, but rather a way of life. Cultural racism involves misperceptions of people, certainly, but it also involves certain kinds of misperceptions of peoples, that is, ways of being and living. This is what Fanon calls forms of existing. It is the dress, the religious practice, the community values, the family formations, the artisanal productions and forms of cultural expression and gender expression, even the types of food that is eaten. All of these now, under the domain of cultural racism, become the signs of backwardness or simply unbridgeable difference. And it is these practices that provide the alibi when societies want to exclude others. We can define cultural racism then very simply as a normative ranking of cultures that is then used to justify exclusion, displacement, forced assimilation, and sometimes violence. The normative ranking is, as Fanon pointed out, unilaterally decreed. But the unilateral nature of the process of judgment is justified by the ranking itself. As Michael Hanchard argues, one of the main strategies of political exclusion is an absolutist form of judgment that decrees who is culturally advanced and who is culturally backward according to universal criteria. Yet this allows culture to serve as a proxy for race or color. Cultural racism defines backward cultures as non-modern, sometimes using the traditional versus historical distinction as developed by Mercier-Eliade. Traditional cultures live in cyclical times, Eliade held. They operate through repetition rather than progress, whereas historical cultures allow for innovation. Individuals from traditional cultures may be acceptable if they assimilate to majority cultures. So in this way, societies of the global north can achieve putative diversity, a token form of visual diversity, in the professional managerial class, and then hold their society to be non-racist. If we use the lens of cultural racism as I'm suggesting, then we can no longer take the test of racism to be whether majoritarian groups can accept minority individuals who assimilate. Both Grossvogel and Fanon are well aware that the form of racism that is focused on cultural practices and traditions did not emerge only in the post-Nazi period, but should be dated to the very beginning of the conquest of the Americas. There were no doubt precursors even before this, but as a systematic approach to ranking human differences in a way that was embedded within the emergence of competitive empires and transnational economies, and as a ranking based on putative science, the form of cultural racism we are still dealing with today is best understood as endemic to the entire modern era. Fanon is interested in the mid-20th century shift from biology to culture because it provided the means to reassert the normative ranking of peoples, just as anti-colonial revolutions were beginning to win formal independence. Fanon argued that a colonial country is a racist country. The question is not whether someone in a colonizing nation has conscious racist intent, because they are embedded within a system of racist exploitation. Thus, he says, we must abandon, quote, the habit of considering racism as a mental quirk, as a psychological flaw, unquote. But part of the reason why colonizing nations are racist nations and why they've been able to maintain practices of extraction post-independence is because of the long colonial history of ideas developed to justify hierarchies of culture. Bringing cultural racism to the fore will help connect present racisms to this long period of the modern colonial world system and its enrichment of what we today call the global north. Protecting the rights to that enrichment is an ongoing task, and part of the way it is protected is by limiting immigration. So my argument will be that focusing on the form of racism that is cultural racism will help us keep colonialism and neocolonialism in the frame, indeed at the very center. The misperceptions of culture that are promoted by cultural racism will also show us quite a different way to think about solutions. It is cultural racism that garners wide public support for the exclusion of immigrants and refugees. It is also cultural racism that created the Indian boarding schools used in North America beginning in the 19th century that separated children from their families, coerced assimilation, attempted to destroy languages, yet were portrayed as humane alternatives to the genocidal practices such as offering rewards for the scalps of indigenous men. The idea, to paraphrase Sartre's account of anti-Semitism, was to kill the Indian but save the man. It was also cultural racism that contributed to the changed attitude toward asylum seekers in Germany after the 2016 New Year's Eve festivities in Cologne, based on lowered standards of evidence gathering and judgment, and quick jumps to judgment. Investigative journalists only found some months later that the number of men identified as attackers on that event was not around 2,000 as initially reported, but 31. So my discussion is going to be divided into 4 parts. First, I'm going to discuss the idea of culture as the terrain of political struggle. Second, I'm going to give some history of the development of cultural racism. And third, explore how cultural racism's ideas about culture and comparative judgment can be distinguished from other forms of cultural comparison and normative assessment. And finally, I will explore solutions to the problem of cultural racism in the form of the theory of transculturation and the possibility of humanism without empire. The solution will not be a happy pluralism or relativism, but a re-understanding of culture as a terrain of power. So first, to begin our exploration of cultural racism, we must begin with the idea and practices of culture itself. Edward Said noted in his book, Culture and Imperialism, that, quote, culture is a sort of theater where various political and ideological causes engage one another, unquote. His point was that expressive artistic productions, as well as the work of their interpretation and critique, can be sites of battle over how the past is represented, as well as how groups and nations are portrayed and judged. Empires endeavor always to control the narrative, and a central feature of colonial narratives involved the ranking of other cultures. Some want to protect literature and art and cultural products of all sorts in a kind of gated enclosure, Said says, as if it were possible to create a free space in which expressive art forms could be appreciated on their own, to be seen as the production of a particular individual rather than a particular society. But this too is a tactic of control, an attempt to methodologically invalidate certain lines of critique, and in this way protect what Said calls the pleasures of imperialism. Such pleasures can include the crafting of narratives in which colonizers are heroic civilizers, made all the more modern and rational and superior when placed in relief against the backdrop of the natives. But there can be also forms of imperial pleasure in the display of the spoils in our museums, and in the unchallenged right to judge, interpret, and curate without oneself being judged, interpreted, and curated. Said is not imputing intentions to the artists, but considering the meaning of artistic works, their influence, their distribution, and their effects. In truth, the idea of enclosing culture and protecting it from crass political judgment is just not possible. Unless a great many people are muzzled or silenced, there will always be contestation over the merit and the meaning of artistic productions. There will always be resistance to the enshrining of imperial narratives, and there will always be an effort to push against the silencing of alternative narratives. In this book, Culture and Imperialism, Said is primarily focused on the high culture of the imperial centers. That is, the culture produced within the metropole for the consumption of its own communities, or at least the educated elites. It is this sense of culture, or high culture, that is defined by Matthew Arnold in the 1860s as simply the reservoir of the best that has been known and thought. Thus, today, what we might call Western high culture had, in Arnold's time, no geographical specificity, no context or qualifiers. The term culture signified a universal and was judged by putatively universal standards to justify its dominion over the mere crafts and myths produced by lower groups. The culture of the imperial centers was the paradigm, or the standard bearer, in genre and content. This approach created stark hierarchies. The very meaning of culture was defined by the West. The only question that was subject to debate was whether non-Westerners, or even the working classes and the women of the imperial centers, could achieve culture. Whether they could write in sonnet form or produce symphonies or novels or paintings with subtlety or sufficient complexity and depth. So the interpreters of culture debated whether other people could achieve culture, but they did not question what their cultures were or how their content, their genres, their forms of expression, and their standards of judgment might differ. We might think then that cultural racism could not arise until the concept of a plurality of cultures began to develop, but that would be a mistake, I'll argue, building from some decolonial Latin American theorists. But what is important about Said's work on Western high culture is his account of how it served to ground the self-understanding of the West, even as it was portrayed as a universal with no geographical qualifier. The works of Austen, of Goethe, of Tennyson and Carlyle and Kipling and so on demonstrated the highest cultural achievement of the human race, and in this way helped to secure the legitimacy of Western claims to dominion over lesser groups. And so Said holds expressive artistic products and the interpretation of their meaning and significance made by experts together created a reservoir for identity formation of a certain sort. Ideas about the cultures to which we are related ground our sense of who we are, since they represent in visual and narrative form a moral life, a manner of reflective subjectivity, a form of intelligence, and in this way a means to both differentiate and rank. Said's claim is that in the contested terrain of culture, it is important to protect positive interpretations, not only for the purposes of empire building, but simply for collective psychic affirmation. So what he's saying is culture is not a side issue, but central to identity, intersubjective relations, hegemony, motivational structure, and solidarity. And also, as Fanon noted, by ranking groups based on their cultural achievements and moral sensibilities, one can appear to avoid less credible biological claims, especially if these achievements are judged by supposedly universal standards. Thus, the decline of biological racism by the mid-20th century simply shifted racial and racist discourses onto the arena of an already quite well-developed terrain. New concepts emerged, to be sure, such as development versus underdevelopment, advanced cultures capable of innovation against so-called traditional societies. Terms like savage and primitive appear less often today, yet the new terms, as David Theo Goldberg has argued, map nicely onto the meanings of the old terms. So the decline of biological arguments for racial ranking did not in any significant measure reduce racism. Some take this as evidence for the human nature claim, but I don't think it provides evidence for that. Why? For at least two reasons. First, because the culturalist arguments emerged since the beginning of the modern colonial world system, as can be seen in the Las Casas Sepulveda debates. And so these were familiar and easy to reanimate in slightly revised and more palatable forms. And second, because the material infrastructure of neocolonialism, extractivist capitalism, and what Charles Mills named the racial contract that governs the global economy remained in force and continued to require an alibi. Cultural racism remains useful today to protect the ill-gotten gains of the colonizing powers. So I've argued that the concept of cultural racism is manifest in high culture, popular culture, and mass political discourse. Our current political divisions are generally seen as a struggle between open racists on the one hand and humanitarians on the other. But neither side need engage with the issue of colonial history. So in the next section, I'm going to turn to a little bit of the history of the development of cultural racism. One of the complications is that, of course, types of racism can combine or overlap. The purported inferiority of certain cultures is taken by some to be caused by biological race, in which cultural racism is simply then a derivative And the real problem is the theory of biological racism, still in place today, of course. But it would be a mistake to hold that all cultural racisms are the effect of biological racisms. The ranking of cultures occurred through geographical and environmental arguments in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, before the biological sciences could offer a physiological sign or correlate of racial types. Prior to the biological was the geographical or environmental theory that hot and arid climates stymied industry and progress, that the indigenous could hunt, fish, and gather the resources they needed without major effort because they lived in areas with such plenty. And hence it was no wonder that their scientific and intellectual achievements lagged behind. This explanation suggested a correspondence between moral and physical geography, as Santiago Castro Gomez argues, or a normative ordering of not of bodies or body types, but of spatial terrains and environments. The failure of the biological explanations led back to the environmental theories later on. If the fact of inferiority was not explainable as the result of genetics, then we need to look at social circumstance, and this includes where people live. These arguments are still with us. In truth, practices of hunting, fishing, and gathering that will produce sufficient amounts to resource large communities require an inordinate amount of knowledge, including the knowledge of sustainable practices, so that sources would not run dry. Such societies often required mobility, and so the sophisticated practices of Micronesian oceanic navigation informed and advanced the capacities of Western explorers. Hunting and gathering communities needed to develop knowledge of how to maintain their environments, leaving a river free to be replenished while moving on to another water source for their food in some seasons. This practice also required the development of political knowledge in order to manage group relationships. To be a sustainable practice, group mobility cannot engender war or conflict every time the community needs to shift its domain. And this requires the ability to cooperate politically with other groups. The indigenous philosopher of science, Kyle White, has a lot of really good work on this. Also, lush tropical climates are not simply bounties of food resources, but dangerous environs that present numerous problems of pest control, requiring empirical observation and reasoning to address the problem and in some cases develop inoculation. The people of the Choco region in Colombia observed that predatory birds, such as falcons, could safely feast on venomous snakes, but that they typically ate a certain vine before beginning their pursuit. Based on this observation, they developed methods of vaccination by use of what they named falcon's vine, inoculating themselves from a deadly snake bite so that they too could operate in areas where such serpents were likely to be found. The Spanish-born Pedro Fermín de Vargas tested their vaccine in the late 1700s and reported on its reliability. The geographical theory of civilizational achievement remains common in current ideations of tropical paradises. You hear people say this about Greece and Italy and Spain today, right? That are thought to produce informal, easygoing cultural practices, a lack of industriousness. But as a causal theory of cultural development, it was rejected by most scientists in the 20th century. Correlations such as those between environment and achievements do not establish causality, and in truth, the correlations were so variable that their purported explanatory role was easily defeasible. But the ways in which cultural achievements were comparatively ranked, and the ways in which the West began to define knowledge and cultural achievement and what it means to be civilized were not challenged by the demise of the geographical explanations of human difference. We continue to rank we continue to assume universal criteria that can identify advanced societies. This is simply to say that normative comparisons continue to be based on manifestly racist ideas and concepts that only a focus on cultural racism can unravel. Castro Gomez shows that in the Americas, the theory of difference that identified geography or environment as the cause was not overturned because the actual achievements in these hot and arid regions gained broad recognition, but because these theories threatened white Criollo power in the region. Fermín de Vargas, for example, says the credit for the Falcon's Vine vaccine, quote, does not go to the people who prepared the antidote, but to the falcons, unquote. Despite their observation, experimentation, and testing, the people of Chocó were viewed as analogous to the animals, thought to happen upon a technique of inoculation. Criollos began to oppose the environmental theory of race, not because of its racism against local inhabitants, but because it began to be applied to them too, to white Criollos in South America. And that what is meant by that term is these are descendants from Spain who had settled in the New World. European colonizers back in Europe argued that even these white settlers in certain environments were degenerating, becoming lethargic, losing motivation, and thus becoming as pacified by the weather as native groups. And note that this was not an argument about the effect of reproductive mixing, though those arguments were sometimes made as well, but an argument that the nature of the geographical region would move all who came there culturally downward. European blood was no match for the effects of tropical paradise on one's disposition and motivation. Such arguments served to legitimate ongoing European rule, of course, which was under serious ideological attack by the late 18th century. Colonial rule gave Criollos significant privileges that came along with their functionary role for the monarchies back home. Privileges including land, but they could not have political independence. So white Criollos began to argue that the geographical theories were neglecting the issue of altitude. They pointed to city-states in the mountainous Andean regions and the highlands of Mexico where cultural achievements flourished that the Europeans could recognize. In this way, they sought to hang on to the coattails of what they classified as the more superior indigenous cultures, such as the Inca and the Aztec, in order to defeat the claim that their own stock was an inevitable nosedive of degeneration due to environmental influences. But such argumentative strategies left the racist criteria used for judging cultures undisturbed. The actual language of racism today is largely about cultures and sometimes religions that act as proxies for cultural difference rather than genetics. The infamous conservative commentator Ben Shapiro argues that it is reason and moral purpose that made the West great, not colonial wars. The US President Donald Trump argued against accepting immigrants from what he called shithole countries, such as my own, in Central America, even if they were refugees fleeing wars and violence. Despite the wars of aggression waged by Christian-dominant countries such as the United States over the past 50 years, with hundreds of thousands of civilian lives lost, it is Islam that is portrayed as inherently oppressive. I could go on, but you get, I'm sure you're familiar with these examples. The cultures of other societies are relied on to play more of an explanatory role than for the West, as Uma Narayan has shown. And this is an interesting point. In regard to the very common cross-cultural problem of violence against women, and in particular the murder of wives or intimate partners, culturalist explanations are used mainly for the global South, while the first world simply has pathological individuals. She notes the major coverage in the Western press of dowry murders and sati in India, coverage that highlights South Asian cultural rituals that seem to be at play in the problem of wife murder. In short, India is portrayed as a land where women are killed for cultural reasons. The epidemic of gun violence in a country like the United States does not get a similar culturalist explanation, at least not within the United States. I know here it's different, thank God. Narayan found that, in fact, men kill their female intimate partners at about the same rate in both India and the United States. All that changes is the manner of killing, which seems to be governed by what is available. Kitchen murders through immolation are common in countries where a container of oil is stored close to the cooking fire. In too many homes in the United States, a gun is more easily available. We might give some elements of culturalist explanations in both cases, but the fact that it is only given in the global South indicates the presence of cultural racism. Like murderers of women, we use what is most easily available to portray their backwardness and our superiority. So third, let me turn next to the topic of culture itself in order to make our way to the issue of the comparison and judgment of cultural forms. And let me start with Said's argument that he makes both in Orientalism and in Cultural and Imperialism, that we must not mistake the focus on culture as a diversion from the critical issue of material resources or from class. Rather, ideas about cultures and the cultural identities that ideas about culture sustain are central to global or transnational relations of all sorts, including military ones. Imperial cultures represent their actions as morally defensible on the grounds that certain territories and people require domination, he says. Empires bring innovation and industry to the underdeveloped colonies. Of course, Putin made claims about the constitutive nature of Ukraine's cultural and historical relations to Russia, and disavowed its claims to cultural and linguistic independence. He is attempting to use cultural reasons to deny Ukrainians the right to political sovereignty. Truly sovereign states, Putin said in March of this year, are grounded in the, quote, inner energy, unquote, generated by common values, beliefs, and history. Thus, the mere existence of a governmental apparatus is insufficient to legitimate the right of non-intervention if the local culture lacks the grounds of sovereignty, that is, inner energy. Right-wing populists argue similarly that immigration weakens the spirit of commonalities that underlie national formations. Speaking in Warsaw and at the United Nations, former President Trump invoked the idea of sovereign societies rather than sovereign states, which are strong only to the extent that citizens are willing to make sacrifices in order to protect and uphold their culture, their faith, their tradition. Such ideas have long been part of modern notions of political community. Hobbes, for example, described the state as an artificial man with a soul expressed in cultural forms. However, we need to take care about the way in which we criticize Putin's claims. Some retreat from the discourse of culture that Putin, Trump, Orban, and others are articulating and replace this with the idea of a political community as minimally bound by institutional and legal commitments. The advantage of this decultured definition is clear. Societies defined by their chosen institutions can escape the historical determinism often invoked by white nationalism, in which a group's cultural history is said to set the path for their enduring future. Avoiding of issues of culture altogether can appear to be the best solution. And so, decultured concepts of society are thought to coexist more easily with pluralism in the religious and cultural spheres. But the disadvantage of this familiar classical liberal approach is that it becomes a form of avoidance, as if what holds societies together is formal, volitional, intellectual, and has nothing to do with shared values, forms of life, or historical experience. We then have no counter-arguments to the claim that immigration will diminish our sense of relational commitments, our willingness to sacrifice for others in our communities. If we accept immigrants, it can only be on humanitarian grounds, which is an act of volitional charity, or sometimes on economic grounds, which is simple self-interest. We avoid the critical reflection on our own culture and can feel justified to demand assimilation, which is an inevitable failure. Cultures and nations are not natural kinds, but the product of dynamic historical movements which are defined and demarcated often by motivated interpretations. As those from the former Yugoslavia know, literary, musical, and other genres associated with Serbian or Croatian identities can be honed, promoted, funded, and shaped into instruments that can be used to try and establish the pedigree of distinct ethnic identities, while in other periods can reveal pan-ethnic similarities. In this way, expressive arts are marshaled to the task of nation building and geopolitical conflict. But the line of argument that would make of culture a unified substance is both a danger and a mistake. Raymond Williams defined culture in his late work as, quote, a realized signifying system, rather than a reservoir or a repository of unified content. In other words, culture is not a way of life of a people, but a process of meaning making, a shared feature of hermeneutic horizons. Williams pointed out that the word culture comes from the concept of cultivation, and so it's not a noun, but a kind of practice. Signifying systems do not produce unanimity or uniformity, but there are patterns. He describes cultures as, quote, organized systems of practices, meanings, and values, unquote, from which new significations can emerge. Williams' approach is useful and helpfully concordant with the concept of the coloniality of power developed by Anibal Quijano and other decolonial theorists. This is the idea that post-independence or post-formal colonialism, global relations remain infused by colonial meaning-making. But Paul Gilroy, and Stuart Hall as well, I think, sharply criticized Williams for conflating national and cultural identity. Gilroy holds that in both conservative and socialist treatments of culture, one finds, quote, an absolutist definition of culture tied to a resolute defense of the national community, unquote. In other words, the assumption is that substantive cultural identity serves to ground national identity, an idea that has the effect of centering some citizens and marginalizing others. For Gilroy, the idea that culture provides the ground of national identity also produces unproductive forms of resistance in the beleaguered communities, such as cultural nationalism and what we used to call narrow nationalism. Such forms of resistance create all sorts of problems, he thinks, such as efforts to make adoption of children follow racial lines. So Paul Gilroy, like Said Fanon and also Amilcar Cabral, is as concerned with the ideas about culture in the resistance movements as he is with the ideas about culture in the conservative mainstream. I share Gilroy's worries, but again, the solution I'll argue, will not be found in separating culture from politics. If we do not define culture as a uniform or unified way of life, I want to suggest we can modify Williams' idea of cultures as sources of signification. This will also help to demarcate cultural racism from other sorts of cultural judgments. In the face of cultural racism, there are hard tasks for those from supremacist cultures in rethinking the very basic epistemologies developed in the modern period. But there are also hard tasks for those whose cultures are misidentified, misinterpreted, and derided. So what makes the judgment of a culture racist? To answer this, we should go back to Said's earlier analysis in Orientalism, which focuses on enunciative modalities, the delimitation of objects, and an overall way to approach knowledge. This is closer to Raymond Williams' concept of a distinctive process of signification rather than its substantive result. The content of concern here in regard to culture is the manner of producing meanings, rather than a settled and closed set of meanings. In this way, Williams' approach can be linked to the concept of a hermeneutic horizon, which is always dynamic and open, but engages in the task of interpretation and judgment of the new from a place that contains substantive content from the past. A useful element of this processional approach to culture is the idea of a cultural imaginary, which is an operational apparatus in a Foucauldian sense. Foucault uses the idea of an apparatus or a dispositif as a larger and looser amalgam that would include laws, institutions, and bureaucracies, but also has effect on the formation of identities and subjectivities. Castro Gomez takes up this concept to explore the apparatus of whiteness operative in most conquest societies. In this case, the apparatus of whiteness is organized with the aim of ensuring a livable life for white settlers. The emerging sciences of man that developed within colonial spaces with taxonomies of population, creation of specific market rules and specific forms of governmentality, gain intelligibility when we see them as connected by this apparatus of whiteness. But this apparatus is concealed by what Castro Gomez calls the hubris of the 0 point, the disinterested, objective, sovereign gaze that manages to deflect reciprocating critical analysis and self-reflection. Coming into a foreign space with unfamiliar forms of life, colonizers took the stance of judge, expert, interpreter, and arbiter of all conflict. The colonizer could judge, but not themselves be judged, except among themselves. This resistance to external critique became instantiated in the scientific method, which is, as de Souza Santos notes, only subject to internal or immanent critique based on recognized expertise and shared methods of knowing. The hubris of the 0 point, then, is this idea of perspectiveless knowing, the knower who need not become the object of knowledge or engage with epistemologies diverse from his own. So in this way, I want to suggest Castro Gomez's approach helps us to see that the idea of culture relevant to the concept of cultural racism is a mode of life that incorporates the habitus of groups and from which new knowledges and new possibilities of action are produced. If some groups have a habitus of being in a dominant position, able to choose between treating the other with cruelty or disregard or magnanimous charity, that habitus is itself not dislodged whether one chooses cruelty, disregard, or charity. What is truly unsettling to such a signifying system and form of subjectivity is when the right to make unchallenged decisions comes to an end. This is what looming demographic changes seem to threaten. Culture as an apparatus, then, denotes practices and a habitus, not conscious intentions. The sovereign gaze of the 0 point enacts racism at the epistemological level by preempting the scope of dialogue. As a signifying system, then, the colonial cultures produce, justify, and consolidate racial perception and judgment, with effects on the patterns of empathy and accepted doxa. Within the colonial matrix of power, biological racism emerged and bloomed for a time, but also other theories of human difference, such as environmental approaches and also evolutionary approaches that ranked groups on a single temporal map of progress as ahead or behind. Some approaches rendered inferior groups beyond intellectual development. But in others, as some modern Europeans argued, such as John Stuart Mill, inferior groups could be brought into the light with the proper forms of education. But this evolutionary development was not seen as creating equality. The position of the 0 point conferred final arbitration only on the most advanced. This is the dominant ideation in the West today, which sees many peoples from underdeveloped societies as advanced only by Western help, cosmopolitan experiences, assimilation to the advanced cultures. The dominant colonial imaginary and its associated apparatus can accommodate structured refugee admissions, affirmative action, the forgiveness of some loans to the world banking system, and other reforms. It can also survive the demise of biological racism and address ongoing implicit bias and the remaining vestiges of attitudinal racism with diversity training and focus groups. But what the colonial matrix of power cannot make sense of is the push against westernization, or the decolonial critique of cognitive racism. De-westernization challenges the West at the epistemic level of its signifying system, and means that the West must engage in dialogic engagement rather than assume a universal stance of unilateral judgment. And so de-westernization feels like chaos and violent anarchy. So unintelligible is it to the mainstream. Cultural racism, then, is most importantly a mode of judgment created over our long colonial history. It's built into scientific practices that claim hegemony and vaccine production on epistemic grounds, and the exclusive right to nuclear weapons. It's not just a misperception of other cultures, but a way of seeing and knowing it is, and it's central to nationalism and ethnic self-formation, but in my concluding section, I'm going to argue it need not be. So section 4. In this final section, I'm going to develop an account of an antidote to cultural racism in the concept of transculturation from Fernando Ortiz. Ortiz's work provides us with a departure point from the West's ruling fantasies of cultural superiority and the hubris of the 0 point. His work also helps to address the concerns of Gilroy, Fanon, and Cabral about the ways in which some forms of resistance to cultural racism and the defense of maligned cultures can reestablish ideals of cultural homogenization, exclusive ownership of cultures, and the possibility of cultural separatism. In Ortiz's work, the border zones of conflict are re-understood as internal rather than exterior to cultural formations. Ortiz was a Cuban anthropologist writing in the early to mid-20th century. His early work manifested aspects of cultural racism and a colonial mentality. In 1906, for example, he published a book on Afro-Cuban practices of sorcery and superstitions, which he took to be signs of cultural backwardness. He urged Cubans as a whole to acknowledge that theirs is an inferior culture in relationship to more evolved societies. This inferior state was not presented by him as caused by race or as inevitable, and he believed that Cubans could choose a route leading to civilization rather than barbarism. Like the celebrated Uruguayan essayist writing around the same time, José Enrique Rodó, Ortiz thought that imbibing European intellectual culture was the cure. Such views are not surprising in the early 20th century. Ortiz had his academic training in Spain and was casting about for ways to improve the lot of his countrymen. As Fernando Coronil argues, Ortiz changed his assessment of Cuban culture as a result of the ferment of new anthropological and social theory during this period. The influential analysis of historian Ramiro Guerra y Sanchez gave a markedly different account of the root causes of corruption, poverty, and political authoritarianism in Cuba. Guerra located the source of the problem not in Cuba's non-European practices, but in its insertion in a global sugar industry with its plantation economy's history of slavery, need for unskilled labor, and a seasonal workforce. The problem was not Cuba's culture, but the particular form and history of Cuba's dependent economy. There were also further developments by social theorists who began to move away from the idea of culture as a singular universal at this time, as Matthew Arnold had imagined, to the idea of multiple cultures that could not be ranked. Franz Boas had an important role to play here with his concept of cultural relativism, but Ortiz was actually more influenced by the work of Oswald Spengler, who was made use of by a number of Latin American intellectuals introduced to his work through its influence in Spain. Prior evolutionary approaches to comparing cultures was moderated by Spengler's influence on that specific cultural forms, such as Afro-Cuban music, so that specific cultural forms such as Afro-Cuban music could be analyzed without being assessed on the basis of its comparison to European forms. So new theories of plural cultures gave rise to a new decentered global imaginary. So it is in his 1947 masterwork, Cuban Counterpoint, which is a treatise on the competing cultures of tobacco and sugar production, that Ortiz invents this new concept of transculturation that I want to make use of here. With this concept, Ortiz intended to provide an alternative to the concepts of assimilation and acculturation, which imagine the possibility of an individual losing their original culture in order to acquire another culture. Thus, both the concepts of assimilation and acculturation are imagined as operating in a unidirectional process. At least in North America, the word assimilado in Spanish does not actually signify a one-way change. Assimilation also often assumes an evolutionary model involving uplift. And acculturation similarly invokes an educational process in which one becomes cultured by adopting or adapting to superior forms of culture. Much of our current thinking about migration continues to operate with these concepts, albeit implicitly, so that the question is, can this particular group be assimilated, or are they too different? Will they be motivated to adopt the ways of the dominant culture, or will they be recalcitrant and oppositional to acculturation? By contrast, the concept of transculturation, as Ortiz develops it, involves a reciprocity that changes both sides. Transculturation is not a one-way assimilation, neither is it a two-way assimilation. It is the creation of something new. Ortiz describes transculturation as a two-stage process that includes loss as well as creation. So I think it's important to acknowledge, as Ortiz does, that in the encounter there is a loss that disturbs the ground of one's prior identity and its signifying system by which new meanings are produced. But this is not a replacement theory, since what emerges in the place of the lost cultural formation is a creative adaptation that involves both collective and individual agency. It is not one culture replaced by another, but a transformation that involves agency of all involved. Indeed, the central feature of Ortiz's account is the reciprocating effects on all sides, whether dominant or subordinate. Cultural boundaries are imaginary projections intended to protect existing forms of domination. In truth, they don't really succeed. The concept of transculturation also, I think, as Coronil argues, has a defetishizing effect. Binary oppositions between us and them may be usefully orienting heuristics at times, but are limited in their descriptive adequacy and seriously misunderstood if taken to be fixed and stable. In truth, oppositions are always only partial. Given that cultural forms are always dynamic, the geopolitics of transnational economies in the modern post-conquest era produce opportunities for new creative forms of sociality. It's not quite correct to name all of these transmutations of cultural forms as theft or appropriation. Perhaps the most important aspect that requires a liberatory analysis is the narrative that is told about cultural creations and developments. For example, when the genre of country music in the United States is characterized as originally white or European, even though its instruments, such as the banjo, and its musical styles, such as picking rather than strumming, were borrowed and creatively transformed from African Americans. So I would argue that new histories of modern science and modern political theory, such as in David Graeber and David Wingrove's The Dawn of Everything, are telling the story of European modernity as a process of transculturation, in Ortiz's sense. It was the encounter with native cultures, value systems, and forms of life that animated the imaginations of Rousseau, Condorcet, Montesquieu, and Kant, sparking new debates about the forms of life previously accepted in the elite circles of European societies. Indigenous peoples did not understand why subordination to the aristocracy was simply accepted, why some people had to prostrate themselves and perform obsequiousness to others, why some people were starving and communities with abundance would do nothing for them. This indigenous critique, as Graeber and Wingrove call it, initiated new questions that in some cases provoked new justifications, but in other cases, such as with Rousseau, sparked new anti-authoritarian ideas. Such new intellectual histories show that even subordinate groups are very much a part of the intellectual and political story of modernity. Yet the myths of modernity, as Enrique Dussel calls them, have misrepresented this process to make it appear that European political progress was self-caused. Ortiz's concept of transculturation comes very self-consciously from the periphery, from a colonized area of the world, to describe the most profound experience of cultural transformation in recorded history. Ortiz writes the following, it's a long passage. He says, "There was no more important human factor in the evolution of Cuba than these continuous, radical, contrasting geographic transmigrations, economic and social, of the first settlers, the perennially transitory nature of their objectives and their unstable life in the land where they were living, in perpetual disharmony with the society from which they drew their living. Men, economies, cultures, ambitions were all foreigners here, provisional, changing birds of passage over a country at its cost, against its wishes, and without its approval. Despite the power imbalance, that's the end of the quote. So what he's saying is, despite the power imbalance, the result was not an acculturation in a single direction, but major transformation of all participants. Ortiz describes Cuban history as an intense, unbroken process of transculturation of human groups, all in a state of transition, and suggests that this is not just the story of Cuba, but of the whole of the Americas. He traces its effects in economic practices, as well as topics more commonly written about, such as the forms of music, dance, and humor, as well as the shared sensibilities of uprootedness manifest in every cultural form. The rumba has no origin story that can establish a pure lineage or a singular geographical source. The antiphonal and percussive elements of Cuban music today is a creative response to the joy that sometimes accompanied contact. Europe has a different history than the Americas. But since the time when it became self-consciously Europe, self-identified as Europe, it too should be understood as the product of a transculturation wrought by imperial conquest and subsequent migrations, moving in many directions, as well as the contact between dominant and subordinate cultural communities here, such as the Roma and Jewish groups most notably. Thus, Europe has been transcultural since its inception, and it is not only now that it is being affected by immigrant populations. Transculturation replaces the replacement theory, but the concept comes essentially out of the experience of the so-called New World or Western Hemisphere, more thoroughly and deeply altered than anywhere else in the European Empire. For a long time, Latin American intellectuals bridled under the European assessment that ours was a debased hybridity, as if the mix of peoples and cultures meant it could have no internal spirit, to quote Trump and Putin again, no cultural essence to contribute in Hegelian fashion to the development of the world spirit. The concept of transculturation here is decisively a more descriptively adequate account of mutual transformations, the inevitability of loss, but the creative agency that is enhanced by the experience of contact. Here is a different source of inner energy than homogeneity, and here there is no 0 point. The practice of normatively ranking cultures assumes distinctions that colonialism destroyed. Cultural racism today is a vestige of empire's attempt to maintain its hold over the historical narrative and the myth of the integrity of boundaries. So I'm going to conclude here with some thoughts on the role of cultural racism in national formations as a way of understanding the sources of its influence. White nationalism is today a transnational phenomena whose basic premise that a community of ethnically homogeneous citizenry has privilege over a geographical territory finds resonance in many non-white parts of the globe, such as India, most notably, in which a kind of ethno-essentialism grounds national identity and the right to exclude. But we should be clear that ethnic essentialisms of this sort are enabled by cultural racism. Others are thought to be justifiably excluded not simply because they may be newer to the nation, but because they have a backward culture. Attending to cultural racism, then, will bring historical and present-day forms of geopolitical domination to the fore. But I've also argued that the solution to cultural racism cannot succeed with the strategy of avoiding cultural issues to focus on volitional political commitments. We need to engage with the epistemic concepts and procedures of judgment that produced cultural racism over the colonial period, and we need to counter cultural racism's claims with a better descriptive account of how cultures in the modern era have come about and what this portends for the future as increased migrations occur across the world. The concept of transculturation instructs against the strategy of defending immigration on the grounds that, don't worry, our country won't change. Some French demographers have attempted to show that immigrants are not to be feared because they will assimilate. And it is true that the intensity of religious practice is reduced a generation or two after immigration, and that intermarriages further affect the children's cultural practices. But this assumes a one-way assimilation and leaves unchallenged the desire to leave French culture unchanged. Some recent political theorists, mostly from the Caribbean, are developing a new creolization approach to imagining political communities. One of the claims here is that the creolization of colonial cultures affected a modernism from below. Jane Gordon makes that claim. That is, change and productive innovations without permanent coordinates. In this process, as with transculturation, there's simply no untouchable base, no foundation principle that remains outside the bounds of negotiation, as Gordon puts it. Creolization is not a resolution of difference or conflict. It's simply an anti-essentialism that acknowledges, like Ortiz, the agency of the oppressed, and it counsels an approach to the future that is pragmatic rather than foundationalist. As Edouard Glissant showed, multiple temporalities and signifying systems can cohabit a space, but they will rub up against each other and feel effects. In her recent book, Creolizing the Nation, Chris Seeley argues that, quote, the political effect of alternative creolizing imaginaries is in the rupturing of existing structures, in the ways those imaginaries contest the directionality and telos of existing power, unquote. Nations are expressions of cultures, but only in this creolizing sense, with structural contingency. Without minimizing conflict, Seit pointed out in his final book, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, that, quote, far more than they fight, cultures coexist and interact fruitfully with each other, unquote. He reminds us that anti-humanism developed in the United States partly out of revulsion with the war in Vietnam and the wielding of the concept of humanism to maintain the untouchability of the humanities canon, then under assault by student radicals. But soon, as he recounts, anti-humanism became infallible doctrine, and it was used, ironically, to represent the Western Academy as more theoretically and politically advanced than any other. Seit suggests we return to Vico for our understanding of humanism not as doctrine, but as based on a practice, a making relation to knowledge. What unites human groups is the human being's capacity to make knowledge, as opposed to absorbing it passively, reactively, dully. He believed that one can be critical of humanism in the name of humanism, and that schooled in its abuses by the experience of Eurocentrism and empire, one could fashion a different kind of humanism. This is, I suggest, a humanism without empire, a rejection of ranked types in favor of the claim that all human groups engage in meaning-making. This was also the basic idea of Las Casas' defense of the Indians in his mid-16th century debate with Juan Inés Sepúlveda. The Aztecs should not be classified as barbarians or animalistic, Las Casas argued, because they had reasons for their actions. Thus, from the very beginning of modernity up to its present day, there have been contesting alternatives to cultural racisms, alternatives we very much need to resuscitate in these dark times. Thank you very much.